Welcome to the Deep Dive. This show is really built for you, the high-achieving real estate pro looking to, get past just doing deals and really understand how wealth is built and kept in this business. We've got a massive stack of research today. Seriously, it covers everything from like super specific tax loopholes and rehab numbers all the way up to big picture stuff like financial derivatives and housing market history.
That's right. And the goal here is to pull all this advanced knowledge together, stuff from finance, behavioral science, operations. It's all relevant. We want to create a kind of roadmap. It's about mastering, how to accelerate your capital, handle sophisticated risks, and really crucially, get the historical context you need to actually navigate these market ups and downs. We're talking about shifting from being, say, an agent or maybe a flipper to being a true business owner focused on long-term wealth.
And yeah, when we say broad, we mean it. We're digging into specific tax plays, like combining the 1031 exchange with your primary home exclusion. We'll break down the mechanics of the BRRR method for operational efficiency, understand why sometimes a great property manager is even more vital than your contractor, and then zoom way out, looking at architecture's impact on value, and yeah, the scary details of the 2008 crash. Credit default swaps included. It's a lot.
It is a lot, but it all connects. It's really a full education packed into one conversation.
Okay, let's kick things off at the strategic level. The investor's mindset. When you get into real estate investing seriously, you're essentially choosing between two main paths, right? Capital gain versus cash flow. For someone aiming to build real sustainable wealth, which path usually offers the most sustainable route to scale?
Well, look, the advanced investor really needs to understand both. But if we're talking true long-term systemic wealth, that's built on the power of cash flow, that predictable compounding income, capital gain, the buy low, sell high approach. It feels faster, sure, but it carries this major tax hit that can just eat away your profits. For that model, the key thing is the holding period. You absolutely have to hold that property for at least 1 year and a day. That's how you qualify for the lower long-term capital gains tax rate, which right now is around 20% federally for most higher earners versus much higher regular income rates.
Ah, okay. So those quick turn fix and flippers,
Yeah.
the ones buying, fixing in maybe 6 months, selling right away, they're basically leaving a huge chunk of their profit on the table for Uncle Sam.
They absolutely are.
Yeah.
Selling before that 1 year mark means the profit gets taxed like regular income,
Mm.
much higher rates. But there's another really critical warning here, especially for people doing a lot of volume. The IRS looks very closely at how fast and how often you're flipping. If you do too many quick flips, they can actually reclassify you, call you a dealer.
Mm-hmm.
And if that happens, your investment income gets treated like earned income. So now you're paying not just the highest income tax rates, but also self-employment taxes on top of that. That reclassification, it can totally wreck the economics of flipping.
Wow, okay. That really makes the long-term cash flow approach seem way more insulated, more sustainable, like you said. It kind of shifts the property from being just something you trade into an asset that's actually working for you.
Precisely. That's the mindset shift. The cash flow investor sees that property as like a little income machine working 24/7. Their decision to sell isn't usually about timing the market peak. It's driven by other factors. Maybe there's a big shift happening, like the local population starts dropping or major infrastructure plans fall through. Or more often, it's about optimizing capital. Can they pull money out and put it into something generating even better cash flow? Or maybe, they've just fully used up the tax advantages from depreciation on that specific property.
Right. And if cash flow is the main goal, just buying one property the old-fashioned way, big down payment, that really limits how much you can scale up. Which brings us neatly to the BRRR, strategy, buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. How does this specific method help investors accelerate their capital growth?
Yeah, BRRRR is basically the financial engine for scaling a rental portfolio quickly. It works because it lets you recycle your capital very efficiently. You typically use short-term money, maybe hard money, maybe private money to buy the property and do the rehab. You're forcing appreciation quickly. Then, once it's fixed up and you have a tenant paying rent, stabilizing the asset, you go for a refinance. You use the new higher appraised value to get a conventional long-term loan. Ideally, you pull out 75%, maybe even 100% of your original cash investment. Tax-free, by the way, and that cash. It goes straight into the next deal. That's the repeat part of BRRRR.
Okay, the rehab part sounds a lot like flipping. Same skills needed there. But if the goal is pulling all your cash back out, what's the single biggest risk point in that BRR cycle? The thing investors really need to nail down.
The absolute biggest risk is the refinance step. Specifically, the appraisal coming in where you need it to. You're counting on that property, appraising for a certain value after you've done the rehab. But if you over-rehab, you know, Put in finishes that are just too nice for that particular neighborhood. Or maybe the market softens just a little bit while you're stabilizing it with a tenant. The final appraisal might come in lower than you projected. And if it's too low, you can't pull out all your cash. Your capital gets trapped in that deal. And that kills the repeat cycle dead in its tracks. So mitigating that takes extreme discipline during the rehab, aligning costs very carefully with local comps. And just as important, managing your timeline really tightly to minimize your exposure to market shifts.
Got it. Let's pivot now to maybe the most powerful tool for wealth preservation in real estate: taxes. You mentioned depreciation earlier. It's a non-cash deduction on your taxes. Can you clarify how that actually generates tax-free income without you physically spending any extra money?
Right, this is probably the biggest advantage real estate has over almost any other asset class. It's huge. Basically, the IRS recognizes that buildings wear out over time, so they mandate that you take a depreciation deduction. Now, importantly, you can only depreciate the building itself, the structure, not the land it sits on. That's usually valued separately. For residential rentals, the structure gets depreciated evenly straight line over 27.5 years. So let's say your rental property brings in $20,000 in actual cash profit for the year. But based on the rules, you can claim, let's say, $18,150 in depreciation for that year. That $18,150 deduction directly shields your cash income. So you only end up paying income tax on the difference, which is just $8,850 in this example. The other $18,150 cash you received, it's effectively tax-free income in your pocket.
Wow. And I imagine those tax benefits get even better when you start using those depreciation losses strategically across a whole portfolio of properties.
Absolutely. Once you own multiple rentals, it gets really powerful. A property that shows a tax loss, maybe because of high interest payments, big repair costs, and that depreciation deduction, that loss, can be used to offset the taxable income coming in from your other, more profitable rentals. So if you strategically manage your expenses and leverage depreciation across all your assets, you can potentially drive your total taxable rental income way down, maybe even close to zero.
Okay, finally in this section, let's talk about a really sophisticated strategy: stacking two major tax laws, the 1031 exchange and the primary residence exclusion. How can you actually combine those two to pull cash out tax-free and defer the rest of the gain?
Yeah, this one requires some careful planning and timing. And you need to follow the rules for two different parts of the tax code. First, the setup. You need to have lived in a property as your main home and then converted it into a rental property. Okay, so IRC Section 121, that's the primary residence exclusion. It lets married couples exclude up to $500,000 of capital gain from taxes. It's $250,000 for single folks. The key rule here is you must have lived in the home as your primary residence for at least 2 out of the last 5 years before you sell it. Now, any profit above that $250K or $500K exclusion, that part can potentially be deferred using a 1031 exchange. But the property also has to qualify for the 1031. That generally means you need to have held it as a rental property for a minimum period after you moved out, typically at least 2 years.
Okay, so the sequence is really critical here. Live in it, move out, rent it out for a couple of years, then sell.
Exactly. When you sell, the transaction kind of triggers both rules simultaneously. First, you use that primary residence exclusion section 121 to take up to $500 of your profit, completely tax-free, cash in hand. Then the rest of the gain, the amount above that exclusion, gets rolled over into buying a new replacement investment property using the 1031 exchange rules.
Yeah.
So that remaining gain is deferred. You don't pay tax on it now. It's an incredibly powerful way to build equity systematically and access large amounts of cash very tax efficiently.
All right, let's shift from the strategy and the tax code to the gritty reality of getting things done, execution. Specifically, let's talk rehabbing, but within that BRRR framework we just discussed,
Right.
if the main goal is getting your capital back out and setting up for long-term cash flow, the rehab isn't about luxury, right? It's about optimizing. So what does tenant proofing really mean in terms of like actual materials and choices?
Yeah, tenant proofing is all about maximizing durability and minimizing those annoying maintenance calls later on. You're not renovating for someone who's going to treat marble countertops like precious jewels. You're renovating for tenants who, let's be honest, might not always be as careful. So you need materials that can take a beating and are easy to clean. But it's a really delicate balance financially. The danger of diminishing returns is very real here. If you spend too much, you create what some people call the champagne house surrounded by beer bottle neighbors. You've basically tanked your ROI because the extra money you spend on fancy finishes doesn't translate into enough extra rent or a high enough appraisal in that specific market.
Right. So the real value isn't about hitting some magic percentage of ARV for your rehab budget. It's making sure every dollar you spend actually forces appreciation and adds durability.
Correct. It's about forced appreciation and long-term durability, not just blindly throwing, say, 15% of the after repair value at the rehab. For high-impact updates that don't break the bank but add real durability, you want to focus on the areas that get the most wear and tear.
Okay, so what are maybe two or three of the most effective high-impact updates you'd recommend? Things that boost durability and tenant appeal without going overboard on cost.
Okay, first, definitely tackle the kitchen cabinets if they're old and dated. Those, old brown oak cabinets, universally disliked now. The most cost-effective fix is painting them. Now, contractors sometimes hate doing this, or they quote high prices because it is labor-intensive, lots of prep work. But updating them to a modern dark color or maybe a light gray or white, it dramatically lifts the perceived value and appeal for tenants. Second, use tile for the kitchen floor. Seriously, kitchens are ground zero for spills, heavy foot traffic, chairs scraping, just general abuse. Tile holds up way better than laminate or even vinyl plank in that high abuse area over the long haul. It cuts down your replacement costs significantly down the road.
Makes sense. Now, operational excellence, especially if you're doing BRRR deals in different markets, it's impossible without a really solid team. Who are the absolute non-negotiable crucial roles you have to fill first?
The absolute foundation, the bedrock of the whole thing, is your deal finder. If you don't have a consistent pipeline of good deals coming in, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
Now, this person could be a real estate agent who really specializes in working with investors, or maybe a sharp wholesaler, a probate attorney, even a specialized turnkey provider. Once you have that deal flow locked down, your next most critical team members are your lender, specifically someone who gets the nuances of the BRRR refinance step, and your property manager.
Okay, let's zoom in on property managers or PMs. They're obviously critical, especially if you're investing from afar. Beyond just, collecting rent, what are maybe two or three really important vetting questions an investor must ask before handing over their asset to a PM?
Yeah, PMs are essential for handling all that day-to-day stuff, advertising the property, screening tenants, coordinating move-ins, dealing with maintenance. When you're vetting them, don't just focus on their main fee, which is usually somewhere between 8% and maybe 12% of the gross monthly rent. You need to dig deeper. Ask them specifically, what is your exact process for handling an eviction? And what's your average time from the first missed payment until the tenant is actually out? A PM who's slow, inefficient with evictions can cost you thousands in lost rent. It's a huge hidden cost. Second question, what's your standard fee structure for placing a new tenant and for handling lease renewals? Some PMs charge a whole first month's rent just to place a new tenant. That's a massive hit to your cash flow right at the start. You need to know that up front. And finally, always ask to speak directly to two of their current clients who own, say, more than 5 properties that they manage. Get real references.
Yeah, that shifts the focus from just their sales pitch to their actual track record. Good point. Now, what about dealing with contractors during the rehab? How should an investor structure that relationship to avoid those constant cost overruns and nasty surprises?
You basically need to take control by standardizing costs as much as possible. The goal is to work with your main contractor to establish clear, fixed base rates for all the common rehab tasks you'll encounter on almost every deal. Things like basic interior paint cost per square foot, standard flooring installation per square foot, maybe a couple of landscaping package options, HVAC replacement, roofing per square. But getting a fixed price list for these standard items, you can compare bids much more easily apples to apples. And you gain confidence that your pricing is consistent from deal to deal. Roofers I've found who are used to working with investors doing high volume, they often give the best blend of quality and price because they want the repeat business, not just a one-off retail job markup.
Okay, last point in this operational section, tenant management. Specifically, there's a subtle but apparently very effective strategy around lease timing. Why is just doing a standard 12-month lease often a recipe for longer vacancies?
Oh, it's a huge, easily avoidable mistake that costs landlords money all the time. Think about it. If a tenant moves in during the winter, say December 1st, their standard 12-month lease will expire the following November 30th. Now you're trying to advertise and fill that vacancy during the absolute slowest, coldest time of the year. Families aren't moving, market activity is way down. What happens? Your vacancy period gets stretched out, maybe for weeks longer than it needed to be. That lost rent during the extra vacancy, it can absolutely crush your profitability for that property for the entire year.
So the fix is pretty simple then, just adjust the length of that first lease.
Exactly. When a tenant is moving in during an off-peak season, don't just default to 12 months. Propose a 15 or maybe 16-month initial lease term instead. This strategically pushes their next lease expiration date into the spring or early summer, the absolute peak season for renting and buying. That simple adjustment dramatically cuts down your potential vacancy time and usually gives you a much bigger, better pool of applicants to choose from. And one more related tip. To encourage tenants to be a bit more responsible with minor issues, consider putting a small repair deductible in the lease. Something like making the tenant responsible for the first $50 or maybe $100 of every repair request. It encourages them to try simple fixes themselves first, like plunging a toilet before calling the PM for every little thing. Saves you hassle and minor costs.
All right, we've covered the technical side, the operations. Now we need to dive into the intangibles, the skills that really separate the top-tier investors. Persuasion, sales, and maybe most importantly, self-mastery. Let's start with sales. The source material mentions ninja selling. What's the core psychological strategy behind that approach?
Yeah, the essence of advanced selling, especially in a relationship-driven business like real estate, is moving past just making a transaction. It's about relational selling. The key principle, the bedrock idea, is that people fundamentally prefer to buy from and work with someone they know, like, trust, and feel like they're in flow with. You have to consciously cultivate all four of those elements. If you can establish all four, the negotiation dynamic changes. It becomes less adversarial, less about squeezing every last penny, and more about finding a cooperative solution. You're not just selling a property, you're selling your reliability, your expertise, yourself.
Okay, so in a real negotiation, say you're trying to buy a property directly from a seller who seems pretty motivated. How can you use some of these subtle persuasion tactics to sort of anchor the price discussion in your favor?
Right, successful negotiation is really about gathering information first, and then using known cognitive biases gently. You start by building rapport. Ask broad, open-ended questions first. Foundational questions like, so tell me about the last time you sold a property. How did that process work out for you? There may be some diagnostic questions like, are you familiar with how properties are typically valued around here? Get them talking. Once you've established that baseline, and it's time to make your offer, which strategically you should anchor low. There's a simple but surprisingly powerful four-word question you can use right after they respond or counter. Just ask calmly, is that the best you can do? It's non-confrontational, but it subtly forces them to reconsider their position. Very often it prompts them to actually drop their price a bit right there, effectively lowering the anchor point for the rest of the negotiation.
Interesting. That tackles the external persuasion piece. But success in business also depends on internal clarity, right? Making sure your message actually connects with what the customer is internally struggling with.
Absolutely. This goes to the heart of frameworks like StoryBrand. So often, businesses focus their marketing on solving the external problem. You need a new roof or your appraisal came in low. But customers, they actually buy solutions to their internal problems. Things like the anxiety they feel about financial uncertainty, the frustration of dealing with an outdated kitchen, the deep desire for peace of mind. Your success hinges on clearly identifying that internal struggle and positioning your service or property as the clear path to resolving it. And because everyone is just bombarded with marketing messages constantly, you need absolute clarity in your calls to action. Vague suggestions like learn more often don't cut it. You need strong, unambiguous next steps. Buy now. Sign the contract today. Book your showing now. Bold and clear.
Okay, shifting gears now to self-mastery. The source material makes a really interesting point. That traditional annual goal setting can actually be a barrier to getting things done. That sounds counterintuitive. Why would aiming for yearly goals lead to procrastination?
It does sound odd at first, but it's about perceived urgency. Annualized thinking creates this dangerous illusion that you have tons of time. The deadline is way off, 12 months away. So subconsciously, you give yourself permission to put off the really important, maybe difficult tasks. I'll get to that next quarter.
Yeah.
This breeds a profound lack of urgency. And the source material argues this is maybe the single biggest driver of mediocrity and potential left unrealized. People get trapped in that someday mindset. Someday I'll build my portfolio.
Right. So how does the 12-week year cycle, which the sources champion, specifically fight that lack of urgency and help maintain real momentum?
By shrinking the planning horizon down to just 12 weeks, you dramatically crank up the perceived urgency. The deadline always feels close, which forces you into action now. The cycle itself is driven by a couple of key, non-negotiable actions each week. First, you plan the week ahead, identifying the absolutely vital few tasks that must get done to hit your 12-week goals. Second, at the end of the week, you score the week. You give yourself an objective score based on how well you executed those planned tasks. If you didn't hit, say, 85% execution or higher, you objectively know you didn't perform well enough that week. No excuses. This constant high-frequency feedback loop stops you from drifting off course. It keeps the pressure on. And the whole thing is reinforced by the weekly accountability meeting, the WAM, where you share your score and your commitments publicly with a small group of peers.
And that execution, week after week, really relies on building consistent habits. How does a high achiever actually build these new productive habits and overcome the mental friction that always seems to pull us back to old, comfortable patterns?
Yeah, habits are fundamentally just reliable, automatic solutions to problems that come up over and over again. So to build new productive habits like consistently analyzing deals every morning or doing a weekly financial review, you have to make the new habit as easy and frictionless as possible. The core laws of habit formation are key here. First, reduce friction. Make it easier to do the right thing. If your habit is reviewing deal flow, maybe set it up so all your potential leads automatically populate into one spreadsheet that's ready to go when you sit down. Fewer clicks, less effort. Second, prime the environment. Make the cues for your desired habit super obvious. If you want to read industry journals, don't hide them away. Leave the relevant one open on your desk the night before. Third, master the decisive moment. This is about optimizing the small choices that have a big downstream impact. Like the moment you sit down to do focused work, make the decisive choice to put your phone in another room immediately.
Ultimately, though, all this discipline seems to hinge on accountability. But the sources suggest that most people misunderstand what real accountability is. It's not just about punishment.
Yes, exactly. Most people think of accountability as something external, something imposed on them, often with negative consequences. But the sources argue pretty strongly that the only accountability that truly drives sustained success is self-accountability. It requires developing real mental honesty, the courage to truly own your thinking, own your actions, and crucially, own your results, good or bad, without making excuses. Success demands that you grow into what the sources call the level 10 version of yourself. That's the person with a clear vision, deep reasons why they're doing it, and the discipline for consistent action. Only that level 10 person is capable of achieving level 10 success. Without that bedrock of self-honesty and commitment, all the other stuff, the BRRR tactics, the tax strategies, the team building, it's likely to eventually crumble under pressure.
Okay, we've spent a good amount of time on the internal game self-mastery operational details. Now let's apply that same kind of discipline, and maybe even skeptical lens, to the big external world of systemic risk. Because the most sophisticated investor knows they have to understand the macro forces that can just wipe out even a perfectly run operation. Let's start with the big one. The housing bubble that peaked around, 2006? What was the core engine driving that massive but ultimately unsustainable demand?
Yeah, it was really a perfect storm, a convergence of government policy pushing homeownership, and, critically, a drastic change in how lending worked. Lenders largely moved away from the old portfolio lending model, where they held the loans on their own books and thus carried the risk. Instead, they shifted hard into the originate-to-distribute model. They were making huge numbers of high-risk subprime loans, knowing they could immediately sell those loans off to Wall Street to be packaged up and sold as securities. This flood of easy credit, often predatory credit, fueled incredibly rapid price increases. It created this dangerous perception that prices could only go up, which drove a massive wave of flipping. People weren't buying homes to live in. They were buying purely for speculation, assuming easy profit.
And the really catastrophic risk was kind of hidden away inside the complex financial packaging, right? The securitization process and the derivatives built on top of it. How did those subprime mortgage companies manage to obscure the ticking time bomb inside those risky loans they were originating?
Well, the originator sold most of the loans off, passing the direct risk along. But here's a key part. They often retained a small sliver, a fraction, of those loans. And incredibly, accounting rules at the time allowed them to book the expected future value of the payments on that retained sliver as immediate profit on their books. Think about that. They were essentially declaring victory and booking profits before the borrowers had even made more than a few payments, assuming everything would be repaid perfectly. This created a perverse incentive to just generate as many loans as humanly possible, no matter how shaky the borrower's finances were. Quality went out the window. The whole machine was fueled by this wildly optimistic assumption about repayment rates, right up until delinquencies started to spike.
And the main tool used by people like Michael Burry to actually bet against these toxic assets was the credit default swap, the CDS. For listeners who aren't familiar, can you just break down what a CDS is and why traders saw it as such a smart, albeit contrarian bet at the time?
Sure. A credit default swap is basically an insurance policy. You buy it to protect yourself if a specific bond, in this case, bonds backed by those subprime mortgages, defaults. Doesn't pay back. It's a derivative because its value is derived from that underlying bond's performance. Now, for traders like Barry, the key insight was that buying these CDSs was an asymmetric bet. This is critical. When you buy a CDS, your maximum possible loss is known and limited. It's just the insurance premiums you have to pay over time. That's your downside. But the potential upside, if those underlying mortgage bonds actually defaulted as Barry expected, the payout could be enormous, many, many times the cost of the premiums. He realized the price of this insurance, the CDS premiums, was incredibly cheap because the broader market simply didn't believe these mortgage bonds could fail on a large scale. It was like buying fire insurance on a house already filling with smoke for pennies on the dollar.
And what was it about the structure of the products themselves, the collateralized debt obligations, the CDOs that made them so uniquely dangerous when the underlying mortgages finally started going bad?
Right, the CDOs were these complex bundles containing thousands of individual mortgages. They were sliced into different layers, or tranches, based on perceived risk. The top layers, the senior tranches, were rated AAA by the rating agencies, supposedly super safe, like government bonds. But the riskiest part was the bottom layer, the equity tranche, and just above it, often the triple B minus tranche. This was the buffer zone, designed to absorb the first losses. The problem was the financial models used to create and rate these things were fundamentally flawed. That bottom, riskiest tranche. It often only needed something like a tiny 7% loss rate in the underlying pool of mortgages to be completely wiped out. Totally worthless. Traders started realizing that the underlying mortgages were defaulting at rates far higher than 7%, meaning these bottom tranches were already toast. Yet amazingly, these toxic CDO tranches were still being priced by the market and the rating agencies as if they were relatively safe, often trading close to face value, like 98 cents on the dollar, even as the defaults were piling up. It was a massive disconnect from reality.
Okay, shifting gears pretty dramatically now. The economic forces that shape our cities and create inequality today, they have really deep historical roots in housing policy, specifically things like historical segregation and zoning laws.
Oh, absolutely. The structural basis for a lot of housing inequality goes back a long way.
Huh.
After World War I, and especially after certain Supreme Court rulings made explicit racial zoning illegal, many municipalities got creative. They started using exclusionary zoning ordinances. These are rules that, for example, reserve huge areas of a town exclusively for single-family homes built on large, expensive lots. The practical effect, and often the underlying intent, was to make it economically impossible for lower-income families who were disproportionately minority families to live in those neighborhoods. So while today these rules are often defended on grounds of preserving neighborhood character or property values, kind of cloaked in class terms, their historical roots often involved a clear, if sometimes unspoken, racial purpose.
And this push towards certain kinds of neighborhoods also fueled the rise of the classic American suburban ideal, right? Families wanting to escape the perceived chaos of the big industrial cities.
Exactly. That whole suburban ideal was partly a cultural reaction. Sociologists sometimes talk about the distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft refers to the close-knit, intimate, face-to-face relationships you find in a small village or a tight community. Think traditional family life. Gesellschaft, on the other hand, refers to the more impersonal, anonymous, sometimes even isolating or hostile interactions of modern, large-scale society, like a big industrial city. So the post-war suburban dream was partly about creating a private sanctuary, the detached single-family home on its own plot of land, to protect that Gemeinschaft of family life from the perceived impersonality and dangers of the Gesellschaft city.
It's ironic, though, because today, many of the most economically successful, talent-filled cities, the so-called superstar cities, are also the places with the worst economic segregation and the highest housing costs.
Yeah, that's the core paradox highlighted in what some call the new urban crisis. Economic segregation, the separation of rich and poor into different neighborhoods, is actually significantly worse in these big, dense, economically booming, diverse metro areas. They act like magnets for high-skilled talent and investment capital, which drives up housing prices astronomically and creates huge income gaps. But here's the counterintuitive twist. Research also shows that despite those insane costs and inequalities, these superstar cities often also exhibit higher rates of upward economic mobility for people born into poor or working-class families compared to less dense, lower-cost areas. It's a complex picture.
Okay, let's wrap up this macro context section with just a quick look at architectural history. Why should an advanced real estate investor even care about, say, the Gothic revival period or the work of Frank Lloyd Wright?
Well, because architectural styles often define the enduring character, the appeal, and ultimately the long-term value of a property. Understanding these historical styles matters for both resale and rental potential. Knowing the periods helps you appreciate the asset. For example, the American Georgian style, popular after about 1715, was all about formal symmetry, classical proportions, very ordered. Then later you get something like the Gothic revival in the mid-1800s. That style appealed partly because it embraced asymmetry, celebrated craftsmanship, maybe felt more natural or useful. And then the late Victorian era brings the Queen Anne styles, say 1880 to 1910, which was all about ornamentation, varied textures, complex roof lines, maximizing visual interest and interior spatial variety.
And how did things evolve from there into the more modern masters we recognize?
Well, you have seminal figures like Frank Lloyd Wright. His whole philosophy was about destroying the box, breaking free from traditional contained rooms. He did this using techniques like open floor plans, cantilevered structures that seemed to float, and a heavy reliance on natural materials like wood and stone, trying to integrate the house organically with its specific site. That emphasis on flowing space and connection to nature is huge in desirable modern design. Then later you get the Mies style, named after Mies van der Rohe, prominent maybe 1950 to 1965. His famous dictum was, "Less is more." That style focused on super elegant, minimalist, modular steel frame construction. Think clean lines, glass walls, like Philip Johnson's glass house. It's about expressing the structure honestly and achieving maximum functional simplicity.
And there's a practical design tip in the sources related to staging a house today, especially an older one.
Right. When you're renovating or staging a house for sale or rent, particularly in the fixed elements like kitchens and bathrooms, the advice is to generally stick to the basic concepts and character of the house's original era. If you try to force, say, hyper-modern minimalist staging into a classic 1910 Queen Anne Victorian, it often creates this jarring aesthetic clash. It feels dissonant, confusing to potential buyers or renters, and can actually detract from the home's perceived value. The goal should be a harmonious result that respects the property's architectural DNA. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow, okay, this deep dive really has covered a huge range. The complexity of advanced real estate is just immense. We've gone from the tiny details of tenant proofing a kitchen floor and calculating depreciation, all the way up to the massive macro risks hidden in financial derivatives and the long shadow of historical housing segregation. I think the crucial takeaway, for me at least, is clear. True mastery in this field isn't just about technical skill. It requires the synthesis of operational expertise, a sharp understanding of those big external risks, and maybe most surprisingly, a really profound commitment to self-discipline and execution.
I agree completely. And we reviewed the evidence, suggesting that, the majority of people who try and fail to build significant wealth often fall for that popular myth, the idea that riches should come quickly, easily, without intense effort. That belief is just starkly contradicted by everything we discussed today. The rigorous demands of executing BRRR consistently, the intricate rules of the 1031 exchange, the non-negotiable weekly grind of the 12-week-year execution cycle. The investors who actually break through are the ones who commit fully to a proven path and critically cultivate that mental honesty needed to own their process, their failures, and their results, day in and day out.
Yeah, that section on the housing bubble was definitely a sobering reminder that markets, even big established ones, fundamentally fail to price risk correctly sometimes. Often, actually. So for you, the disciplined investor listening to this, if you're operating in a market that feels really hot, really competitive, maybe even volatile, how do you ensure that your own focus on internal consistency, on self-mastery, is enough to protect you from being swept up in the next big market irrationality or misalignment?
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? And I think the deepest protection isn't just about perfecting your internal operations or your self-discipline, though those are essential. It's also about maintaining capital fluidity and achieving geographic diversification. As the sources hint, the ability to move your capital efficiently to where it can work best, where the opportunity is greatest right now, that's arguably your strongest hedge against localized downturns or bubbles. Which leads us to the final, maybe provocative thought for you to wrestle with in your own strategy. Is the ultimate defense against these inevitable cyclical weaknesses and market failures the ability to sell high in one overheated market while simultaneously buying low in another, perhaps geographically distant market? That capacity to instantly redeploy capital across markets to capture inefficiency, maybe that defines true long-term wealth protection in real estate. Something to think about.